Hi everyone, my name is Henry and I'm beyond excited to talk to you today about the power of trusting or even relying on the fact that everything comes full circle. Or to maybe look at this topic from a slightly different angle, I want to share with you how I learned to overcome external biases and influences that can, without any bad intentions, just adversely affect our ability to make the right life decisions. So today I'd like to share with you how I felt somewhat trapped maybe just a couple of years ago and how I worked myself out of that situation. You might call this trap a type of imposter syndrome, the fear that you believe you can't really live up to the expectations of your friends, of your family, maybe of society as a whole, suggesting to you what path to follow, what to study, what job to choose. And you can even see it now, right? You can see how your peers and maybe the local politics in the different countries, they significantly change how we cope with the pandemic and its consequences. To look at it maybe a bit differently in neuroscience, you could refer to how I felt at that time as a kind of motivated reasoning. And this is the tendency where you try to find arguments in favor of conclusions that you feel that you should believe in. Telling yourself it's probably better to just follow the expected path instead of deviating from that typical norm in your favor. In statistics, you might be talking about a systematic error or a bias, which you could already read in the title, which is when your data is consistently wrong and thus makes you draw conclusions that are essentially flawed for your decision making. But I'll dive a little bit deeper into that concept in just a minute. But beforehand, you might be asking, who am I to tell you this now? So what I want you to know is that today I'm just sharing with you what I experienced a couple of years ago and what I believe would have just helped me at the time, what I would want to hear at that time. And this is maybe 5 years ago where I just had finished my undergraduate degree, and instead of feeling empowered, ready to take on the world, ready to take on anything, I felt full of self-doubt about my abilities. I felt no self-worth whatsoever. And for several reasons, I just didn't feel, comfortable in my own skin. And as is so often the case, just many troubles came together like in one blow, all at the same time. So my motivation for this talk is that now I see that a lot of my peers are struggling with such similar scenarios, and I just hope by sharing my reflections with you that I can at least raise a certain level of self-awareness for the ones who are listening today. As I mentioned, I'm going to use a simplified statistical analogy, which is just going to help me explain just in a minute why it is so important to listen more closely to our inner voice, our inner calling, or you might call this intuition. But in my opinion, it's just the ability to be fully true to yourself. Because I used to find it astounding that a majority of people around me, and including myself, are still often trapped in these peer pressures. For example, to start off their careers on a path they don't intrinsically even like. Or maybe we just forgot to even ask ourselves that question sincerely. What do we like? What are we going for? So the extrinsic motivations, they just seem to continue to prevail. But then I realized it isn't all that surprising, is it? Because the outside voices are typically much louder, much more dominant, they're everywhere, compared to our inner voices, which are much more subtle and quiet. So I believe this is just the case because we're systematically biased in believing something is right for us just because the outside world suggests that to us. And this is why this talk should be a wake-up call to change that behavior a little bit, to believe in one's own intuition, and to listen very closely to that real, that blatant inner voice that we all have inside us, and thus enabling that everything can come full circle for you. I chose to adapt a statistical framework to help me explain my core message today. Because often, instead of listening to our own inner voice, we try to measure, and that's where the statistical analogy will come in, what everyone else around us is doing, assuming that that will be right for us as well. Disregarding that the environment might be completely misleading because it follows a different agenda, or just because by coincidence or by circumstance, it's simply the wrong environment for you to base your decisions on. So, in statistics or in a measurement of a certain set of data, accuracy describes the closeness of the measurements to a specific value, right? And on the other side, precision is the closeness of those measurements to each other. So here in the visualization, the yellow dot represents your real perspective on a given issue or on a decision scenario. Yet the red dot represents what you believe to be the average perspective of everyone else. So in your perceived relevant environment. So your measurement of a certain belief or value towards a specific issue. And the gray dots represent everyone else, so your current peer group on which you base that average. Without diving any further into statistical analysis, I just want to use this graph to show that it is probably fully human to derive what is right for yourself from your peers and what they indicate to be right. But too often we do 3 key interpretation errors which I would like to highlight, essentially leading to that you misinterpret your own statistics, your inner statistics, which are just highly relevant for our own individual decision making. The first one is your measured value most probably doesn't even really exist, or at least it's probably falsely calculated in your mind and it's majorly subjective. But what is more important in this point is that the measured value should at first always be you and not a perceived average of everyone else. You're the benchmark. That is why the red dot is moving on top of the yellow one now. Your perspective should be the ultimate point of departure. Your decision should be based on your dot and not of the perceived average. The second error we often do, or the second bias, is that we overestimate our ability to understand the precision of what everyone else around us is doing. So we easily get that feeling of being the odd one out, disregarding that probably most people actually feel like this. And consequently, we have that systematic error in our peer evaluation and just draw the wrong conclusions for our own behavior. The third one is that if we realize that apparent mismatch between us and the peer group, we immediately, almost by nature, look for means to take actions to get closer to that peer group. Instead of finding a peer group, or maybe, to put it in other words, to be more precise, letting a peer group evolve around you that actually suits you and your beliefs and your values. In the end, we have to put an end to these systematic biases in our minds. And just to highlight a couple of examples, you could look at the reporting or exclusion bias, which arises due to the systematic exclusion, or inclusion on the other side, of certain individuals from that study you do in your mind. And this is referring to who you allow to impact your decision making, right? Can you really remember the last time you properly left your immediate bubble, those people and that environment that affect your decisions, just to get a different perspective? Another example would be the observer bias, which arises when the researcher, so in this case you trying to come up with a decision, you subconsciously influence the experiment due to your cognitive bias, and your judgment may alter how the experiment as such is carried out. And that's of course referring to your just lack of objectivity, which is in the nature of all of us. So before I start boring you with further statistical analogies, I would much rather create awareness about a specific philosophy that essentially helped me get out of that trap. And this philosophy, it orbits around the sentence by Jens Korsen. He's a German psychologist and a cognitive behavioral therapist, and he says the following. He says, "Where I am is where I want to be." And this sentence probably sounds very trivial to you now, but I took his philosophy and everything surrounding it as a call to get rid of my biases and start to trust and train my inner voice again. Because at the end, you are the best judge of what can make you happy, and for that you need to listen and be aware of where you are and why you're in that certain space. So my perspective essentially started changing when I understood the importance of just taking responsibility for my decisions. Because we easily start blaming the biases that apparently misled us, but especially in our privileged Western world, no one made you do anything. You made those calls. And once you realize that only you are that blacksmith of your destiny, you might call it, you can start acting to improve your decision making and start improving your life. Because you start complaining about, for example, being in a project group at work or university. Think about that you made the choice of being in that respective environment that led up to that situation. You most likely knew exactly that that could have happened or that was gonna happen. With all the information that we can get nowadays, it's only super rarely that we should be surprised in such a context. If you don't take on that responsibility, you're constantly going to drown yourself in self-pity, and essentially you're suggesting to the outside world that you're externally determined, that you're not autonomous. So think about that every decision we make, it's just a cost-benefit balance in our minds, and we decide based on that every day, all the time. Here's the catch. If we give too much weight to do justice to that assumed extrinsic expectation that we're not even sure about, the red dot from the beginning of the presentation, we will continue finding ourselves regretting those decisions, at least in the long run, because that initial balance sheet in our mind was biased in favor of what others think and not your own beliefs. This brings us back to avoiding those three key misinterpretations from the analogy earlier on. One, you should be the essential benchmark. The second one being, you're not the odd one out, and you can never be sure about what everyone else feels, so maybe stop trying so hard to calculate that average perception. And consequently, point three, don't follow a peer group, grow one around you, matching your own beliefs and values. In the essence, what I'm saying is just don't fool yourself, which is definitely what I catch myself doing now and then. But I hear those things where you say that you could also excel in something that you don't fully love or you're not fully engaged with, and that gives you, at least to some degree, a certain level of fulfillment too. But that feeling is just not sustainable. And why? Because out of that fear of missing out on a more fulfilled life, on a more fulfilled opportunity, because we're doing something not out of our own conviction. If others determine our path, you will be caught in regret sooner or later. And you can avoid that just by starting to call your own shots. You can turn that FOMO, that fear of missing out, almost into YOMO, the joy of missing out. Because then even if you're missing out on an opportunity, you know exactly why. Because you chose to do so and you were convinced that your intrinsic balance sheet gave you an unbiased indication and you have the confidence to rely on that. I'm not saying that we should ignore external influences completely. There's plenty of evidence and research that support the notion that we are just a mere result of a mix of DNA and external experiences. I'm saying that we should not completely define ourselves through these influences, and instead, and especially when we're at the start of our careers, but also if we've been following an extrinsic path for too long, we should be confident to follow our intrinsic motivations and listen to them. That confidence, and that is what I learned, will be rewarded and they will be multiplied as you start following that path. You and only you have to make that proactive choice though, to fully concentrate on that inner voice, because only you know what really brings you fulfillment, what makes you happy. So if you find yourself confronted with an important decision scenario, maybe next week or even today or down the road, I would like to suggest a model, and it's called Ikigai. Ikigai is from the Japanese culture. And this model is quite straightforward, and in my opinion, it finds exactly the right balance and the right priorities between the outside and the inner voices. Essentially, Ikigai uses 4 questions to determine your so-called reason of being, which I'd like you to write down now and think about it in the context of unbiased self-reflection, or you maybe do that after the talk. The first question is, what do you love? What brings you joy? It's that feeling of not necessarily explainable, that flow. For example, me now working on a topic like this and then having the honor to speak to you about it. The second one is, what are you good at? Where are your talents? Where can you excel your qualities? I guess in my case now you will have to be the judge, but honestly, we all have certain qualities that make us unique and that pose an opportunity to be just leveraged to the fullest. The third question is, does the world need you? But I like to phrase it a little bit differently. How can you contribute? How can you add to a common goal, something that is just a bit bigger than yourself? The fourth question is someone willing to pay for it? And payment in this case is simply the very hardest measure of validation for the previous questions. And paying for something doesn't necessarily mean in monetary terms. It's just that validation of the robustness of all those 4 questions together. Those 4 questions have not only helped me uncover reasons for past dissatisfactions, but much more importantly, they help me evaluate decisions about my future. And even if external validation, you might have noticed this, is part of these questions, there's a reason why, firstly, they're not listed as the first questions, number 1 and 2. And secondly, if you look very closely, even those extrinsic or more extrinsic questions, number 3 and 4, are used simply because they're relevant in order to check if your answers to the first 2 are really robust. So feel free to jump back and forth between these questions until you feel comfortable with them in like a holistic context. And this, of course, might take a while, so be patient in refining your answers over a significant period, or maybe even permanently, just getting ever so close to an outcome that you're happy with. Before I read into Ikigai and Jens Korsen, I was crushing my brain for quite a while and I didn't know how to get out of that situation. Without confidence, I made externally determined decisions. I was blindly following certain ideologies. And now I feel like I can take on anything, or at least I have the courage to try to take on anything. Before, I was calculating that average perception. I was trying to understand and estimate that red dot. And today I spend most of the time just trying to hear my inner voice and to listen to that inner calling. Without this awareness, all my actions were reactive. And since then, I've become very proactive about my choices, and I feel much more satisfied, even if those choices turn out to be somewhat suboptimal. I know now in retrospective, it's easy to use these philosophies and that model to frame my thinking and my situation from that time. But I'm for sure not going to tell you that this is an explicit solution to a given problem. Instead, I just want to show you why I believe things suddenly fell into place, why things started to come full circle. Coming full circle essentially just means that our intuition, our beliefs and values, they will dominate our life's narrative. So sooner or later, we are just going to be reminded of them. And in the worst case, we've already been following a downward spiral for too long. But in the best case, without that ever happening, because the sooner we listen to our inner voice, the quicker things will fall into place. And I just remember that feeling of being weirdly surprised that things started to work out for me and in my favor, and I wasn't even proactively concerned with them. So this attitude shift just gradually changed one aspect after another in my life. If you take one thing with you today, is that you should really trust that this can happen for you. Especially in the darker moments, you really have to remind yourself of this. It can be hard, but you just have to find that courage to rely on the fact that this effect will happen if you start climbing out of that trap. If you get rid of those biases, it won't happen immediately, but it will happen. So maybe take this as an exercise with you. Just raise that awareness about these biases that are in your mind as a first step. As a second step, train yourself to listen to that inner calling. And what I know is that it will get louder the more attention you pay to it, so it will come easier. And the third point being, act on that calling. That might be tough, but just start basing your micro and your macro decisions on that intuition and just watch what happens. Because one thing is going to be for sure, you won't regret those decisions because you know your reason of being, you know where you came from. Before I close today, I wanted to share with you why I chose the art of Max Bill. He's a Swiss artist you could see on some of my slides. Because for me, his work symbolized the belief that everything comes full circle. And I have that as a constant reminder in my room because I'm also still training and building that awareness and that confidence on a daily basis. However, I believe you can only build that and work on that if you're fully true to yourself. So to achieve that, let's get rid of those systematic biases around us and within us, and let's find our Ikigai. So tell me, what's your reason of being? Thank you very much.